Welcome to another episode of Holding All the Cards. My name's Daniel. I go by Kiramode on the forums. And today I'm going to cover a topic that it has to do with draws. So anyone that has seen enough episodes of this show knows that I like to harp on the importance of main units and decks, right? And when I say main units, I'm not referring to unique units. I'm referring to the size of the unit. So in general, your 4 drops are your mains, your 2 drops are your chuds, and your 0-1 drops, those are your weenies. Right, that's this like rough scale. And then 3 drops, if they're shitty, they're chuds. If they're good, they're mains. That's kind of how your cost breakdown works. So yeah, I mean, I was playing a couple games today, and I got reminded of the difference in dead draws because sometimes I'll have someone show me their deck, right? And so they're showing me their deck, and sometimes one of my early responses is, I think that deck's vulnerable to dead draws. And the response I always get from people, or even when I'm criticizing my own deck, the same response I always get whenever I say, yeah, that deck looks like it can get dead draws is, well, any deck can get dead draws. And the answer is like, yeah, I mean, any deck can get dead draws, but that doesn't mean every deck will get dead draws, and some are much more vulnerable to others. So I did a little bit of thinking, and there's 2 categories of dead draws that I'm going to go over. Well, there's really 3, but one of them is self-induced, so it doesn't really count. So the 2 types of dead draws in Star Wars, there's artificial dead draws and natural dead draws, and I'm going to explain the difference between the 2. So let's start off with defining how cards work. So every pod has effectively 5 slots. You can think of them almost like pitchers, right? So in pitchers in baseball, you have 1 to 2 aces, then you have all the other guys. But one of the things you'll oftentimes hear teams say, right? Like if you talk to someone who likes baseball and their team's sucking, you'll oftentimes hear guys say, we don't have a number 1 pitcher. Now, every team in theory has a number 1 pitcher, right? There's always a best pitcher on any team. However, when people say, I don't have a number 1 pitcher, what they're saying is, our number 1 pitcher is not of the caliber of what a number 1 pitcher should be, right? Or like I remember one time I was talking to a guy, because the Mariners here, we always suck. And what he says is like, look, we got a number 1. Like we have Felix Hernandez. And they say, and everyone else is number 5 pitchers. And that's kind of how it's supposed to be. There's a hierarchy. Star Wars, you can kind of think of it that way too. So the objective, that's one thing. That you can ignore that. Every pod has 5 cards. 5 cards that are relevant for the command deck. You have your 1 slot unit, which is going to be your main unit. Your 2 slot unit, that's going to be your chud. Your 3 slot unit, sometimes it's an event, sometimes it's a chud, sometimes it's a unit or an enhancement. You have your 4 slot, which is almost always going to be either some enhancement or some event, like basically never a unit. And then your 5 slot is always either going to be some event or some fate card. And that's just how the natural progression of these work. You're almost always going to see that sort of breakdown on pods. And then there's pods that are exceptions to that. And them being an exception to that is sometimes what creates dead draws or prevents dead draws because of their natural structure. So here's what a natural dead draw looks like. A natural dead draw is when you draw 6 cards and everything is 4 and 5 slot cards, right? It's all fate cards, cheap events, resources. Like your first 3 slots, your slots that are going to contain any unit whatsoever, they're just not there. Right, so it's when you have those hands where everything's a 4 or a 5 slot card, or maybe you have 1 unit in your hand, but that 1 unit happens to be a 2 slot unit, not a 1 slot unit, and you're like, shit, so I drew my hand, I have a protector and 5 dead cards. Looks like I lose, right? Or you draw a hand and it's like, I got like Vader's Chud, 2 resources, 2 fate cards, and a choke. Well, I mean, what are you going to do, right? Like, what are you going to do in those situations? Sometimes you just dead draw. And that's a natural dead draw. I think every deck is roughly even in that sense. Like every deck is about as likely as any other deck to get a natural dead draw, because that's just a statistical anomaly, right? Like every now and again, like if you just play enough games, you draw, like you're drawing a new hand every turn. So eventually you're going to draw a hand where every single card, or 5 out of the 6 cards, just happen to be cards that are in the 4 or 5 slot, or 3, 4, or 5 slot if you don't have units. And that's like one of those things where it's like no amount of pushing units in your deck is going to make a difference on that, right? Like if you draw the hand where it's all 4 and 5 slot guys, you're hosed. There's nothing you can really do about that. The only way you can really fix that is if you put card draw on the deck. So if you have like the Moisture Vaporator, that's that can sometimes bail you out. Holding all the cards can sometimes bail you out. Kraken's Chud can sometimes bail you out. Dodana, if you have anything that costs mana, can sometimes bail you out. I mean, that's about it though. There's not like a ton of stuff. On dark side, you have the shuttles. Objective can sometimes bail you out. Like if you draw a hand that's all trash, maybe you play a Sith Library and top deck like a Vader or something, but odds are if you dead drawed, you're just going to lose that game. Like shit happens. Now, that's a natural dead draw. So the natural dead draw is where all the cards are just in the back end of your slot system, right? Your 4 and 5 slots, you just got all the crap cards there. All right, natural dead draws. Now let's talk about artificial dead draws. So artificial dead draws are brought on by flaws in the deck. Now, sometimes the deck if it's good at some stuff and it's good at other stuff. And one of the beauties of the pod system and of the game we play is you have to make compromises. So maybe you make a deck that's really good at, having awesome edge tricks, but part of the price to pay for that is you're playing a lot of 1-unit pods and you're more susceptible to artificial dead draws. So here's what an artificial dead draw is. An artificial dead draw is when you draw a crap hand, but if you were playing another pod, you wouldn't have a crap hand. So I'll give an easy example of this. Let's say you're playing Core Luke, right? So Core Luke, your 1 slot's Luke, great. 2 slots of Twi'lek, pretty shitty. 3 slot is your Trust Your Feelings, that's all right. 4 slot is your your resource, and I guess your 5 slots your lightsaber. I mean, how you rank the slots, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the number on the card, right? Like, so just because it says 2 of 5, 3 of 5, 4 or 4 of 6, that doesn't determine your slot, because there's some pods where the main unit is actually the second card listed. An example of this would be pilot pods. A lot of pilot pods, your 1 slot unit is going to be whatever your ship is, and then your 2 slots your pilot, and your pilot's not even a unit, it's just an enhancement basically. So anyways, going back to this example, I think everyone that's ever played with Core Luke as a 2X has had the hand where every card is either a 5 or a 4 slot card, and their 1 card that they have that is not a 4 or a 5 slot card happens to be the Twi'lek. That shit sucks, right? Like that is one of those things that's terrible, where you'd prefer anything else over that. This is where, if you compare it to Endor Luke, so Endor Luke, I think you can say has a worse card than any of them, right? You would take any card in Core Luke over I Am a Jedi. With that said, Endor Luke comes with a speeder bike. So if you draw a hand that's like all trash, right? It's all 4 and 5 slot cards. It's just fake cards and resources and cards that's just not helping. And you have 1 card that is a 2 slot card, but that 2 slot card is a speeder bike. It's still bad, right? It's still a bad turn, right? Like that is a turn where you're still probably going to lose the game, but it's definitively better than a Twi'lek. Now let's take it one step further. Let's say you're playing Hera. So Hera comes, your 1 slot unit is Ghost, who's fantastic. Your 2 slot unit is Hera. Hera is like in some decks actually worth a 1 slot unit. Like if you have enough neutrals and specters and she's delivering guns throughout, she's definitely worth a 1 slot. Your 3-slot unit, or your 3-slot card is going to be Phantom, who Phantom would be in the discussion for the best 2-slot cards. That's how good Phantom is. Your resource is your 4-slot card, and your mission's your 5-slot card. So if you draw a hand that's, again, 5 out of the 6 cards are 4 or 5-slot cards, but then your 1 card is Hera, not great, but definitely passable, right? Like, that's not a hand that's going to lose you the game. And so this is how artificial dead draws are different, right? Like, oftentimes when people call artificial dead draws, they call them Jedi draws, right? Like, the Jedi draws and the Sith draws, that is like, you know, the nickname people have for these draws. I'm going to call them artificial draws, or artificial dead draws for this purposes because it works for both sides. But it's when that happens, right? It's like when you're playing Hera, you have less artificial dead draws because Hera herself, because you also have Ghost. Ghost has already taken up that 1-slot card. Hera makes it less likely you're going to dead draw because playing Hera is a passable turn. Playing a Twi'lek is not a passable turn. And so I'm going to explain why people call them the Jedi draws and the Sith draws. If you look at Jedi has a lot of pods that induce these dead draws, right? That create artificial dead draws. So we just went over Core Luke. Another example of this would be Owen. So Landspeeder's a good card. Owen's a good card. Like, Unfinished Business is a good card. I'm not saying any of those cards are bad. What I am saying is anyone who's ever played Owen has had a hand where you play Owen and you don't play shit else. And that's one of those things where Owen's a fantastic card, but one thing that Owen's not a unit. It may have the unit type, but it's not really a unit. Owen at best is a weenie, at worst is really just an event. And so if you're ever in a position where you need units, you just need guys on the table, and you draw Owen, there's a decent chance you're going to dead draw that hand. And that's an artificial dead draw, right? Like when you have like Owens and Twi'leks or Nudges, you know, or even the second copy of Yoda, you see Yoda, because that's often a problem. So one of the great things about Yoda is you have that early game consistency of you effectively have 4 Yodas in your deck that you can make sure that you get that Yoda within the first 2 turns. The problem is once you already have Yoda and you're looking to build your board, if you draw into the second Yoda, or more importantly, you draw into the Yoda You Seek Yoda, because Yoda You Seek Yoda is a 2-slot card in that pod. Yoda's a 1-slot, Yoda You Seek Yoda is a 2-slot, Nudge is the 3-slot. When you draw the 2-slot card and it's Yoda You Seek Yoda, but you already have a Yoda on the table, or both of your Yodas are already dead, now you have another artificial dead draw, right? So these are the ways that Jedis sometimes dead draw on themselves. And it's not, this is a different type of dead draw, right? Like when you dead draw like this because you just don't have extra units in the deck, that's an artificial dead draw. When you dead draw because you just draw all the 4 and 5 slot cards, it's different. Now Sith also runs into this problem, because where Sith runs into this is every Sith deck runs Palpatine. But Palpatine's 6 mana, so you're definitely not playing him turn 1, probably not playing him turn 2, and hopefully you could play it turn 3, but probably not playing it on turn 3 either. So you run into this situation where if on turn 2 or turn 3, like let's say you just had an edge battle the turn before, you're max drawing, you draw Palpatine, but you only have 5 resources, Palpatine's a dead card, right? Like Palpatine's only good for edge at that point. And now if you draw other stuff, great, like more power to you. But if Palpatine's the only unit in your hand and you can't pay for him, that's a dead draw. So like that's where sometimes Sith has problems. Council, like a lot of people love playing, or used to love playing Council of the Sith. Kawadi Security Team's terrible, and the other guy's just a resource. So this comes down to one of those spots where I think the resource is your 1-slot card in there, which you compare the advisor to any other 1-slot card. I'd take just about any other 1-slot card. You compare the Kawadi to any 2-slot card, you'll probably take in most any other 2-slot card, right? So you don't want to draw into those cards, but sometimes you do. Sometimes they're the only option available. Or like me, I like playing Arden Lyn, but Arden Lyn's kind of a not very good 1-slot card, and the what's it called? The Sith Apprentice kind of just a bad 2-slot card. Like, he's mediocre at best. Or let's say you play Inquisitor. Inquisitor is, in my opinion, the best early game 1-slot card that Sith has available to them. The price to pay for him, though, is that if you play Inquisitor, you have the chances of also drawing into his Chud at the worst possible time. Like, I think if Inquisitor had like a regular Chud, because like his Chud is really a 3-slot card. So let's say the Inquisitor's pod were Inquisitor slot 1, a Mara Protector slot 2, and his Chud slot 3. That's okay, because his Chud's really a weenie, right? So I kind of like having weenies in the deck, but I don't like having weenies as my 2-slot card. That's also the problem that the Shuttle runs into. So the Emperor's Shuttle has a lot of really cool stuff going on there. And the Shuttle itself is a pretty decent 1-slot card. But the Pilot, it's not really a unit to begin with. And even if you do look at it as a unit, it's a bad unit. So what are you going to do with it, right? That's one of those things where you draw and you might get another artificial dead draw. Whereas you look at Navy. Navy is probably the least susceptible to dead draws. Or at least to artificial dead draws. Because you have the Gladiators. That pod in and of itself is absurd. Because all 3 units are like pretty close to mains. Like, I don't know if the Gladiators, I would 100% call them main units. Like, they're kind of situational based on the board. I think if you have Chimera's objective out, all 3 of them are main units. So having 3 cards that are all justifiable 1-slot cards, that just means you're not going to dead draw as often. Then you have Chimera. You have one of the best 1-slot cards available to that faction. And you also have the Shielding Ship, which I don't think it's as good as a main unit, but it's better than most Chuds. So you have that. You throw in, you already have Tarkin, who's really good. And so like Tarkin's probably the best 1-slot card that Navy has. And then they also probably have the best 2-slot card in the Stormtrooper Assault team. So that's pretty stupid. Golan defense platforms, you get 2 1-slot cards that are right there. The Death Star gives you no slot cards, right? Like, the Death Star is just, everything in the Death Star is basically a 5-slot card. But the resource ramp makes up for it, and the only reason you can play the Death Star inside of these Navy decks is because you have the Gladiators, because you have Chimera, and because you have Tarkin. Like, you have these pods that already improve your consistency, so you don't dead draw, right? You don't have these natural dead draws because you're already playing the core of Navy, and it allows you to get greedy. It allows you to actually play a pod that's nothing but economy. It's economy and an occasional late game win condition, but you can do this because you have these cards. If you didn't have Chimera and you didn't have the Gladiators, and now you're playing the Death Star, all of a sudden only having resources is going to start hurting. You're going to have a lot of weak deployments where maybe you spam out a bunch of resources, but you don't have any blockers, and you're just going to start having all these artificial dead draws. But until they restrict the Death Star with the Gladiators or make it so the resources of the Death Star can't be used on capital ships, you can expect the Death Star to continue being a pain in the ass for everybody. Now, there is a third type of dead draw which I want to talk about. This one, I don't think it goes to the other 2 categories. This is just stupidity. So I'll see this happen a lot of times, more on light side than I see it on dark side. And here's what it is. So you play your turn, right? You deploy your guys, and you have, say, 4 cards in hand. Let's say all 4 of those cards are not units. If you have a 4-card hand and there's no units in there, you better attack. Like, you have to attack. I don't care what the board state is. You need to find a way to get rid of these cards, because this is where you run into a problem. If you have 4 cards that are non-units, if your opponent just doesn't swing into you, if your opponent doesn't give you a chance to throw away cards for edge, you discard 1 card, so you have 3 cards that are non-units. Now you're only drawing 3 more cards. So if at that point, if you're only drawing 3 cards, or sometimes I'll see it where people will have 5 cards that are like non-units, or maybe they'll have 5 cards where like 4 of them are non-units and 1 of them's like a chud or something, and then they just don't attack. If at that point you're only drawing 2 or 3 cards and then you dead draw, I can't have sympathy for you there, right? At that point, that's not bad luck. That's just bad play. If you're giving your deck a very good opportunity to screw you over, that's your own fault, man. This is also why I think that Kyle Katarn is really underrated as a pod, because Kyle gives you just the ability to prevent artificial dead draws. So on the one hand, you have Kyle himself. I don't think Kyle's the best one slot unit, but he's not the worst one either. He's passable as a one slot unit, but you get 2 of him in the pod. So you get 2 one slot units for the price of 1 pod. Additionally, you have Ron's guidance. So there's often times where you draw a hand, it would have been a dead draw, but you had a Ron's guidance. So you play Ron's guidance, you pick up a Jedi, and now you have a chance. And that's the key, right? Like sometimes you just need to play anything to prevent these artificial dead draws. And like Kyle's one of those pods that does a really, really good job of preventing artificial dead draws. And then there's pods that you're just begging for artificial dead draws, right? Like there's some pods where I think Brainiac's a good example of this, where I love Brainiac. I think he does a lot of cool stuff. Getting good draws is not one of them. Like, because this Brainiac himself, he's one of the best chuds in the game. He's still a chud, right? Like, he's still 2 mana. He's still able to get killed by Moment of Triumph. You can deadly sight him. He only has 2 health, so like 2 chokes and he's gone. There's a lot of ways you can deal with him. And he's just not, like, if your whole turn is Brainiac pass, that's a shitty turn. It's a really bad turn. So you run into the situation where it's like, okay, Brainiac's not a main unit. The chuds, they're weenies, right? Like, they're not as good as your typical 2-drop, right? Like, if all things being equal, let's say you had 3 resources to spend, would you rather spend them on a Brainiac chud, or would you rather spend them on a Believer in the Old Ways? Sadly, you'd probably rather have a Believer in the Old Ways most of the time over one of Brainiac's chuds, because they have 2 health and they have an extra icon, and you'd be kind of a fool to take them if all things being equal, right? Given their cost, given that one's twice the price of the other, that's totally different. But like Brainiac's chuds and Brainiac himself, they're at their best when they're played alongside other stuff, right? Like if you play other things during your turn and then you play them, like so if you play Yoda and then play one of those astromechs, that's great. If your turn is you play an astromech and some other 2-drop that's not Brainiac, now it's kind of crappy. So Brainiac's one of those cards that it's like, I feel like when you play him, you need to be very, very aware of your draws and do everything you can to prevent dead draws, because already within the structure of your deck, you're already asking for artificial dead draws. So your playstyle needs to be different with Brainiac, right? You need to make sure that you're cycling as much as you can. You need to make sure that you're probably not pitching units in edge just because you're going to need to play them. Whereas there's other decks that can get away with just being more aggressive. There's other decks that have a beefier unit count that they know they can discard a unit or 2 in edge and it's fine because they're just going to draw more. Brainiac decks can't quite do that. You know, you're playing with fire a little bit more there. So anyways, that was the idea of this episode, just trying to distinguish between artificial dead draws and natural dead draws. Remember, the natural dead draws, you can't do much about them, right? They happen to everybody, and if it happens to you, you're going to lose. But the artificial dead draws, that you can fix, right? Like the artificial dead draws is one of those things that you can make sure you don't play Sabine as a 2 of if you don't have Hera to back her up. You can make sure that if you play Brainiac, you play heavier pods along the way. You can make sure that if you play the shuttle on Darkside, that you either play a lot of card draw alongside the shuttle or you just play cards with more meat on the bone. You can make sure that if you play Jarek, that you have a little bit more on the quality unit count, or just have more kill spells. Because that's the other part of this too. Kill spells can sometimes function as units. So like, if I have a Force Lightning in hand, that's almost as good as a main unit. Like it's almost as good as a 1-slot unit just because I'm removing their best unit in all likelihood. So like tempo-wise, we're still even pace. Same thing with Captured, right? That's part of the reason why Dengar is such an absurdly good pod. You have a 1-slot card in Dengar who's good, and then you also have Captured, which is also like a 1-slot card. You have the Chud, which is a decent enough 2-slot card. That increases your consistency. It makes it so you're going to have less of a chance to have these artificial dead draws that are just incredibly frustrating and a way that nobody ever wants to lose a game. So yeah, that was this episode of Holding All the Cards. Hope you enjoyed.